Good afternoon, and welcome to our monthly Hungry for History lecture series. I'm Luciana Spraker with the City of Savannah Municipal Archives, and I'm pleased today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Deborah Johnson-Simon, who will be presenting Finding Virginia Jackson Kiah, a Notable Savannah Woman. Dr. Johnson-Simon is a museum anthropologist and the founder and CEO of the African Diaspora Museology Institute, a research lab dedicated to scholarly investigation of the history and culture of the African diaspora descendant experiences surrounding Black cultural institutions. She has worked for over 30 years on museum and cultural heritage projects in several states, including Arizona, Florida, Maryland, Virginia, South Carolina, and now Georgia. Dr. Johnson-Simon has conducted research on African descendant museums in Belize, Ghana, and Halifax, Nova Scotia. She earned her MA in Anthropology and Museum Studies from Arizona State University and her PhD in Anthropology from the University of Florida, and is taught at Santa Fe Community College, the University of Florida, and here in Savannah at Savannah State University. Dr. Johnson-Simon is the author of several books, and just a few of them include Culture Keepers Florida, We're Cooking It Up Again, Recipes to Celebrate the 1983 Blacks in Museums Directory, Anaya and Grammy, A Virginia Arts and Alzheimer's Story, Kiah Museum Day of Remembrance, a quilt exhibition, and she is the co-editor of the second generation of African-American pioneers in anthropology. She is currently working on the Kiah Museum Story, which documents the life and work of portrait artist and museum founder Virginia Jackson Kiah. And it is her work to celebrate and further the legacy of Virginia Kiah that led me to ask her to come today to share Kiah's story. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Deborah Johnson-Simon.
Thank you, Luciana. You took up a lot of my time just giving all of that, and I appreciate it. Because that kind of saves me from going back over some things, because a lot of what I plan to do today with this presentation is to kind of, in some ways, do chronicle my finding of Virginia Kiah. And so if I could make sure that I do this right. The picture that you see there was just contributed to the Museum Institute, the Museology Institute, by one of her family members. One of the things that is a myth is that she had nobody. And so therefore, people were thinking that the things that were happening surrounding the Kiah Museum was because of fighting or family or just neglect, or just that sometimes what happens when people die, they leave your memory and you have to be reminded of who they are and what they came to do. But this picture was donated by a family member because we're doing some genealogy on the Kiahs, both Virginia and her husband. So let me make sure that I'm clicking this right.
Put the arrow on the right side.
Okay, there we go. So I'd like to start out by saying that as most of people know who do a little bit of research or a lot of research, it has to start somewhere, and it has to start with the question. So for me, 2008 was sort of the beginning. Curious date, right? But at that point in time, the only thing I knew about Virginia Jackson Kiah was that she was one of the participants in the directory that you mentioned, Blacks in Museums, that was produced by the African American Museum Association. They published that directory in 1983. So that started some wheels turning about me. But also in 2008, serendipity, I found myself back in Baltimore, which was also the place that Virginia Jackson Kiah was raised. some of the cultural materials that we found on Virginia shows Baltimore as her birthplace, but it wasn't. But she was raised in Baltimore. And I had taken a job there at Morgan State University. Growing up in Baltimore, I didn't know anything about Virginia Kiah. I didn't know about the Kiah Museum. And you would think I grew up with that. But you'll see through this story that a lot of those things kind of came around for me. Kind of a window opened up. But I took a job as a registrar at the James E. Lewis Museum. The James E. Lewis is a part of 3 museums that's owned by Morgan State University. And the James E. Lewis Museum was the Museum of Art. And that director that we talk about was the directory that was a part of his collection. He was an artist and the founder of that museum program at Morgan State University. One of the first museology programs at HBCUs was started at Morgan State University. So that was kind of interesting for me, you know, coming there as a trained museologist, anthropological studies, and so forth. And so I was selected as a team that was a part of a team that was going to work on reopening the Lily Carroll Jackson Museum. And that was the museum, the second museum that was started by Virginia Jackson Kiah. What we see here is a portrait of Virginia Kiah's mother. And for many years, most of her working life, Virginia Kiah was known as a portrait artist. That's what she built her reputation on, doing portraits. And it started for her as a little girl, but one of the things that she wanted to do was to make sure that portraits were done of the most important Black people of the era, starting with her mother, who was a civil rights activist. Now, as a part of that restoration team, you can see from this portrait that it's beautifully done, and the colors are, well chosen, and she captured a special look on her mother's face. Her mother was always photographed. She never allowed a full face picture to be done of her, and that was because at Johns Hopkins University she was disfigured. And but this picture, you can see she's beautiful, and the colors are done with a lot of love and attention that shows the kind of sensitive portrait artist she was. So one of the things that I'd like to kind of make sure that everybody understands, when you say you study Black museums, what does that really entail? How do people study museums? And particularly since so few of the African American museums come on the academic landscape, to tell the truth. So we learn about museums through the collections. Museums are sort of done by type. That's not a curious thing for anthropologists because we are so used to classifying things. We have to put things in some kind of order. So in studying museums, we need to know the types. And the type of museum, whether it's an art museum or a history museum, is done by the things that are in their collection. So any artifacts, papers, anything that you find, letters, primary sources, artwork for art museums, is a part of those collections. And so for me to study now the Lily Carroll Jackson Museum, I needed to know how it's really situated, what was in that collection, and what were those things about. So that picture of the mother was a part of that collection. So when I started to try to find the stories that are attached to the Kiah Museum, to Virginia Jackson Kiah, who was the founder, because a museum is not just a building. A museum is about the people who are a part of putting that together and the thought that goes into building that collection. So one of the things that was really important that I found was an article in that collection. It was a clipping from an Atlanta Constitution article by Helen Smith, going to notable women of Maryland. So it was dated November 9th, 1974, and it captured my attention because, you know, here is the story. This woman, museum that I'm studying, it's like, wait a minute, it's right here. Everything in this short article. And, well, it's blown up here, but it was really very important for me at the time. And it said on the byline, she couldn't go to museums, so she started one. But as you go through the article, guess what? Not only one, but two. And she was instrumental in helping others to establish museums as well. So for me, the first becomes last. And I use this article to learn more about this notable woman. She was also featured in this book that was the bicentennial book. So this was part of the materials that I was gathering to learn more about Virginia Kiah. You know, how much was there? How much is left? We end up as a part of a museum movement, or this sort of bringing celebrity to certain people by seeing what was left behind. So this was very helpful because in 1977, when this was done as a part of the Maryland Bicentennial, I thought, well, I'm not going to find anything from this book because her family was so important to Maryland history that I would find more about the sister who lived and worked in Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C., and whose marriage made her probably one of the most notable women. There are schools that are named for her sister, Juanita Jackson Mitchell, whose husband was Clarence Mitchell, and who was the 101st congressman, senator. And her sons went on to go into politics. I thought it would be chock full. Not one single chapter was written on the sister. But there was this wonderful chapter by Beverly Chico that was written about Virginia Kiah. And it became another resource for me to start to build a work of what I would need to learn about Virginia Jackson Kiah. These are her parents. Virginia was the oldest child of Kiefer Albert Jackson and Lily Mae Carroll. You saw the portrait that she did of her mother. Again, you can see how she has a side view so you don't see that. But it didn't stop her. Her real activity started After that surgery, after she gave her life to God and to her people. So her father, doing some of the genealogy work, we find Virginia, her mother, her siblings, on census reports, sometime as mulatto, sometime as Caucasian, and sometime as black. Not because of passing, but because these things were done by census takers. They classified where you would be. So you can see from the look of both of them. Also, her mother's line, just to get back to the genealogy for a second, was traced to Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the last signer and the Catholic signer of the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence. Please don't let me go on record for getting that part wrong. So, but the father was born in Mississippi, witnessed lynchings, and went to Alcorn College, a black institution, and became a filmmaker. And they became traveling evangelists. All of them were very deeply religious. I don't think too many have seen this image of Virginia with her siblings, but this picture was shared with me by Morgan State University and the Mitchell family. So here on the left with this adorable little bow in her hair is Marion. And Marion would grow up to be a concert artist. In the center with the beautiful pearls is Virginia, Kiah. And next to her is her sister, several months apart. I mean, as close as you can get in those days. And that's Juanita. And this little man is the first and only boy born to this couple, and his name was Bowen. Now, my next thought was, how in the world did she accomplish the things that she did? You can see that in her family, people didn't take a lot of no for an answer for the problems that existed in education. Her parents wanted to make sure that all of the children had the kind of education that they wanted and they needed. But as Virginia matured, she had to, in my eyes, find that perfect mate. And she found her soulmate when she finished college, her college education, at the museum school in Philadelphia. Now, if we go back to this article by Smith, she couldn't go to museums, so she started one. We know that as a child, she was turned away from museums. She was not welcomed at museums. But she never stopped loving art and wanting to produce art and to be associated with it. So her mother found a way. There were no schools in Maryland that would accept a black person into a school for art or museums. So she went to the museum school in Philadelphia. And in 1931, she had completed her college education in Philadelphia. And she came back to Maryland with her teacher's certificate from Pennsylvania and was able to teach in the Baltimore Public School to teach art, back where she was raised. And she became a faculty member at the Frederick Douglass High School. Now, who else was there but Calvin Lucurgus Kiah, who was from Princess Anne, Maryland. His father and his family was associated with Morgan State University. Most of them started their degree programs at Morgan State University. As a matter of fact, his father, Thomas Kiah, Thomas Henry Kiah, was a minister, a Methodist minister, a part of the Delaware Conference, and he was also a principal and educator at Princess Anne Academy. Princess Anne Academy, if you look through some of the old census records and directories, you find that Princess Anne Academy was a sister school or a smaller school that was associated with Morgan State University, well, before it became the university. And later, it would go on to be a part of the Maryland system, and it was the first HBCU on the Eastern Shore. So Princess Anne Academy later became University of Maryland Eastern Shore campus. His father would not live to see that happen, but of course that's another story. So she picked the perfect mate. Now, to throw in just a little bit of drama for this, her mother and her father, her mother by this time was well known for her work with the NAACP. She had started the work that would bring that organization to be one of the largest in the nation at that time. And needless to say, her mother had a mission and a goal to knock down all the walls that would keep her children from succeeding at anything that they set their mind to. But in 1931, Lily Carroll Jackson and her husband, Kiefer Albert Jackson, did not find this football star and educator, teacher, to be the catch that they would hope for their oldest daughter. So this couple, I guess you could say, just let love prevail. And when you look at material culture, the next thing we find is an article in the Afro-American newspaper where the couple had eloped. And their license appeared. So good friend Carl Murphy, who ran the Afro-American, also ran the article, football star marries beautiful artist and teacher, Virginia Jackson Kiah. But 1 year out of, less than a year, just a semester out of getting that degree that everybody worked so hard for her as the eldest daughter, she marries this young man. And not only that, to add insult to injury, they moved to the Eastern Shore of Maryland, where he took on a job teaching, and she followed this love of her life, and he later became the principal of a high school there. But he also had a lot of very significant accomplishments there, and they both went on to continue their education. Needless to say, she was a very beautiful woman, and for the next few years, they continued their studies, and he earned his master's as well as his PhD from Columbia University, and she worked with some of the most famous art instructors that were available to her at the time, and became very celebrated in her own right. And her mother finally started to adjust to that. And by the time he was about to go into the military, her mother was working with her to build that collection for a museum she would have one day. With his PhD, he was courted by Savannah State. And so in 1952, they were here, and he was hired in the education, to start the education program. He taught social sciences first, and then he became a part of the education program to build that program at Savannah State. But by 1959, Calvin and Virginia had purchased a home in Brownville. They had another home on Polk Street. And I didn't want to throw that in, but we're looking at about 10 years, and you're going, like what? That's this big gap between there. And that was, sometimes we have the starter home, but they raised enough from the sale of that to purchase the home he had promised her. He promised her a home large enough that she could have a museum. So on November 28th, 1959, they bought this beautiful home at 505 West 36th Street in Savannah, and opened it to the public. And over that time of her mother helping her with collecting pieces, there were over 2,000 pieces that were a part of their collection. It's also important to remember this date because in 1959, she also became a co-founder of the National Conference of Artists, which is another significant organization at that time for black artists in the U.S. They were having trouble with getting a lot of recognition and a place where they could come together. You would think that Harlem would be the place or whatever, but it wasn't. It was in Atlanta that a group of black artists came together to form this National Conference of Artists. It used to be the National Conference of Black Artists, and it's changed, and today it's the National African American Conference of HBCUs. I mean, it's still going on. We evolve and change to become these special places. But this National Conference of Artists, this was a significant date because at this juncture, just before the 60s, you're seeing a lot of activity with civil rights and these things going on and people trying to have a place. So we're going to skip ahead just a little bit to 1974. Because this time in Smith's article, we see that Calvin is recruited to desegregate Georgia State University. And he was the vice president of academic affairs. But she was very tenacious she wanted to make sure that she knew everything there was to know about having a museum, and having a museum that would be the equal of any other museum. So her museum was never called a black museum, so I want to make sure that that's straight. But it was always about her people and making sure that they had access to the quality kinds of artifacts, artwork, information that any other museum could amass. She called it a museum for the masses. That's anybody who really did not find themselves comfortable and accepted at other museums. This museum for the masses was also unique in that she wanted it to be like the museums where she first found herself welcome, which was the Smithsonian. And she said it was a mini Smithsonian, and in many ways it was, because it incorporated just about all of those, I guess, 10 museums that were a part of that national mall. She had African art, she had Asian material. They had traveled all over to make sure that they had things right here in Savannah for those masses, those people who were in rural communities or whatever. So at this time when he's in Atlanta, she didn't drive. She's going to be with him. They were inseparable. So let's get that part straight. When I said she picked a mate, she picked her mate. They were inseparable. And so she found ways to commute between Atlanta, and you see her hours for the museum change with that move. She wanted to make sure that people who had availed themselves of her museum here in Savannah would still have that and will see whatever. So she commuted between the two, and she also, by that time, had become a member of the Coastal Museum Association. It was called the Museum Association of Savannah. She was not only an individual member, but an institutional member of that organization. So she was, according to this article, I better put my, to Smith, it starts out saying, when Leah Gaines, chairman of the Governor's Committee for the United Nations Association, wanted some children's art from around the world for the traveling UN exhibit, she knew where to go. Virginia Kiah, wife of Calvin Kiah, Vice President of Academic Services at Georgia State, has in a way a little nation, a little United Nations in Savannah. So talk about what she contributed to Savannah. She had it on the map as a little United Nations. And so she was appointed to that committee, and in some of her papers, we find her on the letterhead that went out to different places across the world and across the nation to find children to participate in the UN. It did not happen just in that one year. They continued to use her and the Kiah Museum. And so with her learning to commute between those places, it also became a place where she also developed a group of students here in Savannah who would work with her to learn how to travel these exhibitions, and also to share their artwork. So we're definitely looking to find those kinds of things as we continue to do the research for documenting the legacy of this amazing, notable woman. So she was putting together traveling exhibitions of art produced by children in 17 countries by 1974, right? And between the ages of 11 and 18. 1975, she loses her mother. Now, her family was able to move out of the colored section, Negro section of Baltimore, and purchase a property on Utah Place, which is in Bolton Hill, which was one of the fashionable districts in Baltimore, in the city of Baltimore. It was a home that, as a little girl, her mother had delivered laundry to this very house. And she said one day, if it ever got where she could do something about it, she would own that property. And she did. But she always credited God. She said God blessed it and gave her an opportunity when the opportunity came to be able to purchase that place. But the impressive part of this is that when she died, her will stated that that house would not be for the family to live in. It would be what Virginia always wanted in Baltimore, to have a place for the masses. So it opened in 1978 after about 2 years of really working after her mother passed, for 3 years, and became one of the first privately owned museums honoring an African American woman. Okay, so from 78 to 80, and I know my time is, I'm a modem out. But Virginia commutes between, she's now commuting between, now she was born in 1911, so pay attention to these dates, all right? She's commuting between Atlanta, where Calvin is still vice president at Georgia State, and Savannah to oversee her beloved Kiah Museum. She's now working on her mother's museum and getting that up and running and developing a friends group there. She's dedicated her life to these students that she's worked for, because all of this work with the museum was to train up the next generation of artists, of black artists, who can make a living from their craft, from their work. She wanted them to have the skills and the discipline and the mindset to know that they can make a living. Some of the early articles that I found on her, that was really her quote. I want people to know that they can raise their families and they can make a living from producing their art. If they love their art and train for it and do the best that they can and learn how to be business people about it. She was a businesswoman, so she was not some, frail, faint of heart, always leaning on Calvin. No, the two of them were a team. All right, so by that time, he's ready to retire. And the couple can now devote more time to not just being in Atlanta for his work, although they had developed the relationship there to work on, certain projects and things. But they can have serious time with building the Kiah Museum for more work, as well as the museum, the Lily Carroll Museum in Baltimore. So, in 1983, that was kind of my entree into her as a museum professional, because that's the year I found her in the directory. All right? But in 78, she and Margaret Burroughs become founding members of this museum association, the African American Museum Association, the first professional museum association of black people. All right? It was a logical progression because they had worked together starting NCA. And Margaret Burroughs, a noted artist, I think you all have some of her work in the city. She's known worldwide. They were very, very good friends. We found letters between them, as well as their communication about the NCA and other things. But as fate would have it, they're advancing in age, as I said, and 1994, it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to keep up all the maintenance of doing this. Let me just insert this into the conversation. There was never a charge for visiting the Kiah Museum. There was never a charge for the Lily Carroll. It was to always be open and available. Raise money the best way we can, dig in our pockets, do what we can to make sure that there are things there for people to see. But it's hard when you're retired. And it's hard when you're aging. And you can't do that. So they started kind of divesting some things. But by on August 5th, tomorrow, is the anniversary, and we'll be taking some of our kindness rocks. It's another project that we do out to Calvin. But in 1994, he passed away in Savannah. But they had set the wheels in motion for things. They had no children. They had these nieces and nephews, but they had no biological children of their own. And none of the nieces and nephews ever lived in Savannah. Maryland people, sorry. But, so it was easier for them to support work to uphold the Lily Carroll Jackson, because it was right in the area where they were actively working with the political issues and other things that were involved in civil rights. But because there was this deep connection with Morgan State University, Virginia and Calvin, which Savannah, Morgan State was his alma mater, and his family were very involved with them. So they started negotiations with Morgan State University. If anything were to happen to them, they would want that university. All right, now in the will, you have to kind of go back to the will. If at any time something happened to Virginia, Juanita's children were to, then be able to do something with the property. But because Virginia knew her mother's wishes, she wanted it to be where it would always be a museum, and a museum there for the masses and for somebody to understand. Her mother became a museum woman. She loved her daughter, her oldest daughter, and she wanted to support her in that. So by '96, Morgan State acquired that museum. It was beginning to run down, but in those years, right after he passed, she was tenacious about getting them. And they even got McKeldin, who was the governor at that time, to really start to look at it in a serious way. They used the political clout and everything that she could to remind them of the legacy of her mother. She protected that place. But by 2001, December 28th, she dies in a nursing home, alone. Well, she was being cared for by SCAD, but they had isolated her from the family. So some of that is controversial. It's a kind of a he said, so we're not getting into that today because that requires some further, heart searching. But what we do know is that within 2 days of this dynamic woman's passing, there was a graveside service. Too fast and without notification or any input from that family. Within a few months of that, the house was boarded up. Things moved away. And by 2002, it's in probate. Okay. I come to town, come to Georgia in 2011, and by 2013, if anybody believes in the ancestors, I think people were bothering me. But anyway, I end up here, and I'm thinking I'm going to find a group of people actively taking care of her legacy. But, I think, sometimes it takes somebody coming from somewhere else with that nudge and, that new energy to introduce to the topic. And I guess that fell on me. And so I did put together a small band of people. But this is a notice that was in 2013. I came in June, so that had gone up in April. Vacant and unsafe. And you can see that that beautiful building that we saw earlier, this is what it was coming to. Now, I'm trying to do some of the legwork for people and put together, I joined the Coastal Museum Association. I think that's what she would have wanted me to do, to be with the people that she was working with. And I started to teach at Savannah State, the anthropology, and incorporate museum anthropology in it. So that's why you see some of these students. Don't look at me. But anyway, you see Mayor Otis Johnson. But that's some of the first programs we started to put together. I visited the archive at the city to see what kind of things were there, avail myself of the W.W. Law papers. He's another preservationist that deserves a lot more research and study. People need to be coming in here using those papers. And I also started doing some oral histories, talking to people to see what things they did remember about them. And I found that there were a lot of things that people had just forgotten about. But once they started to think about them again, there were good, a lot of really good things, and some curiosity about, well, what happened? While we took a nap. We used to taking naps with this pandemic. I take a lot of naps these days. But so this is my last slide. So let's look at 2020. Let's look at, what can we do as friends of the Kiah? What can we do with the story in light of a pandemic? We're a very informal group, those of us who continue to kind of collect this legacy. And we were out, I was out on last Wednesday putting some things, we did a wreath laying for W.W. Law. And because that was the 29th, that was his passing, the date of his passing. And I had a student from Savannah State who wanted to continue to do some things there. I said, well, then just go cut the grass. And if anybody runs you off, just say, I'm sorry. And we'll try to take care of it as best we can because it's in horrible condition right now. And he sends me this picture that has gone out to the administrator that's over the trust. Things are in a trust, have been since 2002. And it says that within 30 days of that notice, that the blight tax is now going to be assessed to the Kiah. And we know that with that, that's kind of the beginning of the end of it. But I think that we need a little hope. We always need hope. And I'm so glad that the Georgia Trust is doing this Preserving Hope, because students and others have gone by and held up that sign that said Preserving Hope at the Kiah House. But we also applied for places in peril to see if we could find a dedicated buyer or an attorney that will work with us, or whatever kind of thing that we can do to cure this horrible situation, or what I see as a horrible situation. We've also applied for a historical marker. We raised enough money for the historical marker during this pandemic, okay? And we're gonna face this situation with this notice of blight and the assessment with that same kind of hope, that if nothing more, there'll be somebody that will continue to tell her story. So thank you for allowing me to share what I haven't. Any questions you have, I'll be more than willing to answer.
I do have a few questions.
Thank you.
As your pandemic audience, asking questions for everybody.
Okay.
I do have a few questions. You mentioned that she was instrumental in helping others start museums at all. And you know, can you mention what some of those other museums might be?
Oh, okay. Because her real draw was those who were involved in the art world, and she was actively working to work on art museums and art institutions. So what she was doing was training her students to be prepared to work in these places. She learned about collections management, and she did those kind of things right within her home, because they had a working museum that was there. So one of the museums that was started in Maryland, that also came out of Morgan State University, worked with the Lily Carroll and Virginia Kiah and others, was the African Art Museum that was started in Columbia.
Another question I had is, when you talk about what became the Kiah House Museum, the house in Kyler Brownsville, so the Kiah specifically bought that house to be the museum, right? They identified that as a good museum property?
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up, because most people think that what we want to do as an organization is to have another museum there. That's not the goal of the Friends of the Kiah. Our goal is to save that beautiful property and to be able to tell that legacy. But yes, he promised her when they first married, and he promised her and he promised her mother that they would have a house large enough to have her museum. I mean, and it had everything. People remembered the animals because she saw it as natural history, a natural history museum. I can send you links to a video that Professor Kiah Walker at Savannah State put up on YouTube. We were able to get some footage of her giving an actual tour of the museum. And yes, it's raw. It's seriously the home video of that time, and but what it does is it gives you a real opportunity to see the kinds of things she had collected. It was never just about her art. And she, points out on the wall, different things, either students made or she made kind of give a brief mention to one of her pieces, but it was always about other Black artists and things that she collected or she exhibited, and it was her goal to have this mini Smithsonian. So it was like natural history. People remember the bird, and one of her nephews came down, and we took him over to see the property, and he told us, he said, one time he was visiting and he couldn't understand what the bird was saying, and Dr. Kiah told him that Virginia taught him French so he could tell me to shut up.
I had two final questions, and
Okay.
you've answered one a little bit, but I'll just ask it again in case you have anything to add. You talked about doing oral histories with people. What is maybe a memory that somebody has related to you, either about visiting the museum or about how she impacted them, that really stuck out to you when you did the oral history?
There's so many. Okay. My mother had dementia, and she came to live with me, and I was just starting to teach at Savannah State, and I was just starting to do some of the work here. And so I used to take Mom around with me. Well, Dr. Clyde Hall and his wife Maud Hall were very good friends of the Kiahs. And one of the first people that I met, as a matter of fact, they organized a lot of the early meetings of getting people to First Congregational Church and other places for me to interview. And I remember him talking about the Kiahs. And I told Dr. Hall that one of the things that someone had told me the other day, I thought she was the one that did all the tours. And he said, oh, no, Calvin did tours too. And I said, are you serious? I thought it was her place. He said, he told me that if anybody had told him when he was, coming up and deciding on his career that he would be living in a museum, he would have laughed, And it was like the way Dr. Hall told that, I could see him saying it. And he said he had such a good experience, because he said she would ride in the back seat, and the two of them would be in the front. They went everywhere together, including, with him and his friends. And it wasn't always the wives, but Virginia was always there with him. And so, I'm just from that, it's just memorable, because others had said, how close the two of them were. And I'm just surprised by that she lasted as long, but I think it was things that they had decided that they needed to take care of,
Okay.
That kept her going.
And then my very last question is, we know where the house is and what's going on with the house now. What happened to the collections that she had amassed, those 2,000 pieces? Did they go to the family? Do you know what happened to them?
That is the first question everybody asks me. And the first thing I always say is that it was my first question too. What happened to all those things? Because we were able to see some of those pieces in old photographs and things that we had collected. They have not ended up on the active market for things, so I don't know. But I think she would want us to find out. I think they both would want us to find out. And that's why we can't be finished with this. If the house gets demolished or whatever happens, we can't be finished until we get this whole story together.
Well, that was going to be my first question, so I'm glad that other folks had it, but I did have one of the most distinctive feature of the home is that window.
Yes.
That giant window. How did the window come to be? Was that in place when the Kiahs purchased the home, or did they place that window there?
From one of the articles, I went to the Maryland Historical Society because an oral history was done of Virginia and her sister, with Virginia and her sister. And it was a lot of information. It was a part of the McKeldin Oral History Project. And because they were active with the NAACP and civil rights, this family, this rich oral history was there. In it, they talk about that when Virginia and Calvin bought that house, when she saw the house that she wanted, it was mainly the neighborhood. They started the first sort of home improvement. So they helped other people on that street within those blocks where they live with home beautification, inside and out. The bricks that you'll see in the front, the old Savannah bricks, they wanted the same bricks right there in that neighborhood that they had in the downtown and other really nice neighborhoods. The tree-lined street, you'll see a big tree that's right in the front that almost crosses the street, lots of shade. The window was Virginia's design. They became the contractors for the house. And they transformed it, took everything out so that it would have a space so that whether people knocked on that door and came in or not, they would be able to see those things and know that they were always welcome there. So it was her design.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson-Simon.